Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Assemblymember Markio Yamada, and I hope that you are all getting settled with your lunch and your chip bags and all that good stuff. It's always a bit of a challenge to be the lunchtime speaker because it's either you're competing with the eating or, you run the risk of putting people to sleep because of whatever the blood sugar issues. But anyway, again, I'm Assemblymember Markio Yamada, and I'd like to first thank Joy Redmond for her stellar efforts in organizing my participation in your day-long activities today. She is just a burst of energy. I first met her at another event when she extended this kind invitation to me to join you for these brief moments. I currently chair the Assembly Committee on Aging and Long-Term Care. It is the only standing committee in the legislature that addresses aging and long-term care as a policy area. There are certainly other committees that address the issues that subsume aging and long-term care, including health and human services and transportation and retirement, and all of those committees address aging and long-term cares by their basic code sections in the law. But Aging and Long-Term Care Committee has been around for a number of years, but it does not have a real strong code section. So for you attorneys out there, in terms of committee jurisdictions, our policy committee, though I believe is a very, very critical and important one for the future of California, really is very restricted and narrow in terms of what we are able to cover. But we do address Older Americans Act, Older Californians Act, and for purposes of today's discussion, fortunately, we do have jurisdiction over seniors and persons with disabilities in residential settings. So I think that's a good thing for us. I know you've had a pretty robust morning already, hearing from a couple of panels and getting the framework for what your discussions will continue to be this afternoon. You've heard some perspectives from residents and perspectives from providers and regulators. So I think you already, hopefully by a show of hands, you already have the framework for what the current law is in California. Is that right? You all have it. There's a quiz at 4:30. That's why. But I think what I'd like to share with you is a little bit just about my own interest in this issue area, and that is that it's both personal and professional. I am a social worker by background, and my specialty has been in aging and long-term care probably for about the last 25 years of my almost 40 years of rattling around working somewhere. But it was very personal as well, because I took care of my own mother for about 23 years. She was either living with us or near us for about the last 23 years of her life. And so watching her journey from relative good physical, mental, and financial health through this journey towards the end of life was really a very challenging chapter in not only her life, but in the lives of her family members and certainly extended family members. But she was with us for those almost quarter of a century towards the end of life. So I became very familiar with the different range of services and, frankly, the fragmentation of the services that are offered as an individual or family member begins to navigate this journey at the end of life or towards the end of life. What we would like to consider sort of the golden years of our lifetimes are a little bit rusted and tarnished, it seems, or have been through this particularly difficult chapter of our country's financial existence. We know that there are many challenges that older adults who perhaps had planned for a certain level of retirement have seen their retirement accounts or their other financial portfolio issues sort of vaporize. And so I think those of you who are addressing CCRCs in particular, I think it's a good thing that you're having these conversations, because we know simply by the demographics that this is a population that is growing rapidly. We all know that the baby boomers are turning 65 at a rate of 10,000 a day in our country. And that, if you give about, say, a 10% of those folks here in California, we are already home to the largest number of older adults in the nation, and that is probably not going to change too much. So it is an important issue area to focus on. It seems like there's not a day that goes by that there is a headline that is calling attention to the need for additional oversight, additional participation at all levels of community dialogue about the future of this population and how we will care for ourselves and care for others. I think from the legislative perspective, and I did mention that I chaired the standing committee on the assembly side, one of the, I think, troubling developments for me over this session, of course we're just about 90 days or so into it, but on the Senate side of the California legislature, there used to be a subcommittee on aging that was under the Senate Health Committee. However, as of today, March 21st, 2013, there is no subcommittee on aging. There is nothing formal, I think, on the Senate side. And I think that's, both concerning and disturbing at the same time, because again, just the demographics alone that we know we're facing would suggest that there should be at least some area that we know that aging issues and long-term care issues are going to be addressed. Now, I'm not saying that the Senate's not going to address them. I'm sure somewhere in the framework these issues will be addressed, certainly through code section and so forth. But the fact that we don't have a specific, say even a staff member, a consultant over on the Senate side that we know we can go to with aging and long-term care concerns, I think should be something that all of us begin to ask about. And in fairness to my good friend, Senator Darrell Steinberg, who of course represents us here in the Sacramento area, I haven't had a direct conversation with him about it, because usually we don't cross houses that way. We usually are sort of defer to each other's houses in the leadership. But I would certainly hope that if any of you have some concerns in that direction, that might be a good question to ask as to how aging and long-term care issues, as a very rich policy area, will be covered over this next 20 months or so. And I, of course, turn into a pumpkin myself. This is my final term in the California Assembly, so I feel a greater sense of urgency that some of the policy discussions and issue areas and potential legislation that I would like to see addressed before I term out at the end of 2014 are addressed, and there is some continuation of this dialogue. I know there will be, this Assembly Committee will continue, I like to say over my dead body, maybe that's not such a good thing to say, but that we will certainly continue to advocate and support the continuation of this standing committee in the Assembly. So anyway, you know that CCRCs are an important part of the long-term care discussion and continuum. These are resources that are available not to the usual folks that the state usually has more concern or control over. Most of the state's response and responsibilities are for those who are impoverished, quite frankly. Those folks that do not necessarily have the means to participate in the CCR system. as many of you who are residents and participants know, and also providers know, what the costs are to enter a CCR, a CCRC community. It's not inexpensive. And you also want to ensure that there is sound financial footing for this care continuum, because the contract is that upon entrance and upon understanding all the rights, responsibilities, and regulations that are associated with CCRCs, that you are essentially guaranteed a level of care throughout the progression towards the journey towards the end of life. I think it sounds like a very good idea, and I think that we know that these communities can only continue to grow. But I think the question that you are raising and addressing today from multiple perspectives is, how are we going to keep all of this in balance? And that's really, I think, the touchstone issue is we have many competing interests, and what also is the role of government, either at the federal level or the state level, to ensure the safety, security, well-being, and frankly, the financial soundness of all of these kinds of services and organizations. I can give you a little bit of the background on some of the legislation, or some of you have already discussed some of the legislation. I'm sure that is established what the current CCRC regulatory environment is. But I think one of the sort of the overarching issues in terms of the legislation that has been put in place over the last decade are that it's largely been focused on protecting the residents, protecting the consumers of these services. Going back to 2006, we had SB 244, Gloria Romero, that addressed certain residents' rights. Also SB 1212, Tom Torkelson, who is now our superintendent of public instruction, did a bill that would require disclosure by the providers for whatever reserve funds that there were, and also includes a clarification of the transfer process to higher levels of care. So those two bills were in the 2006 cycle. Then a little bit later, AB 1169, Assemblymember Ira Ruskin introduced legislation that further increased transparency issues in financial reporting by the CCRCs and established clearer limits on transfer of CCR funds. We also had in 2010 Jim Bell, Assemblymember Jim Bell, AB 407, although he's now Senator Bell, introduced legislation to ensure that if a provider was faced with a permanent closure, that there would be a certain amount of time, adequate notice, and time for residents to find a new location. And there were some compensation issues involved in that too, in terms of closures of a CCRC. And then AB 1433, which was also Assemblymember Jim Bell and Assemblymember Mike Eng, who is now on the Community College Board in Southern California after turning out from the legislature, addressed certain protections for residents for temporary closures. So there have been a number of bills that are in effect that strengthen rights of residents. One of the more perhaps controversial pieces of legislation and bills that I have been involved in involve the transfer of the regulation for CCRCs from Department of Social Services to the Department of Insurance. Assemblymember Dave Jones introduced legislation that addressed this issue, was not successful. There were other iterations of this bill, including one that I introduced as well. I think this is an issue that will continue to arise. The legislation that I introduced previously, because of the very difficult budget times we were in, and frankly, the strong voices that we heard from the industry, and the focus that I think our insurance commissioner had at the time on addressing other priority bill areas for the department, we determined that the bill could not go forward in the last legislative session. There is no legislation introduced this year either for this very controversial issue. But I think the fact that we're having these conversations again just suggests to me that we need to have continued dialogue on how best we are going to serve this growing population of older adults who have certainly worked and earned a right to a comfortable, safe, and secure retirement. This is not something, I say, as I said earlier, that is necessarily accessible to all. But for those who are able to enjoy this type of retirement future in California and certainly in our country, I think deserve to have this conversation continue. So with that, I know that you have additional panels on financing and on rights and responsibilities coming forward this afternoon. I wanted to certainly leave time for specific questions that you might have and other just general policy issues that might be on your mind. I did want to reference, however, I think the very disturbing event that occurred in Kern County just a few weeks ago. I wanted to add some clarity to those who may still be following this story. This was the case of the older woman who was an independent living resident in a multi-level facility. It's not a CCRC yet, but there is a CCRC application pending for this facility. I believe it's Glenwood in Bakersfield. And the excruciating 911 call, which was a little over 7 minutes in length, that was frankly viewed all over the country and all over the world, I think was something that caught everyone's attention because we all asked ourselves, how could something like this happen? How could someone who was clearly experiencing some sort of a medical event not be aided? It was a question, I think, that caught all of us and caught our attention. What we have learned about that particular situation is that there was nothing illegal about what happened. There were conflicting reports in the news and then later verified by the facility that the nurse, who by the way was an LVN, was following company policy not to aid this individual because of a company policy, because that was understood that medical aid could not be rendered, but the policy was to call emergency services and wait. That wait was long, very, very long in terms of what we all heard. Now, we also heard, of course, later in the news and verified later by a report that there was no DNR order on file. There was no do not resuscitate order on file. So, there are many lessons about this situation that we could take away, and that is, it's a hard topic sometimes to discuss, but directions at the end of life can certainly save yourself and your family and emergency responders a lot of grief. But the investigations, there were multiple reviews going on. We certainly were in contact with the California Department of Social Services that had regulatory authority over the RCFE portion of the multi-level facility, and that's what they wanted to take a look at. And of course, I did not find anything. We were hoping we would get a final written report in time for today's event, but that's still pending. But we know that in independent living, even in a multi-level facility, there's no obligation, there's no regulatory requirement for any medical intervention to be made. So in terms of the point of reference, from the holistic standpoint of the CCRC, I think the policy question is, should there be a basic BLS, basic life support standard in a multi-level facility? And we are very fragmented because there's no regulation in independent living. There's social services regulation in assisted living, and then there's public health or healthcare regulation in skilled nursing. I wonder if we have not made this too complicated going forward for the future. We are talking about a population that on any given day, even within a given day, this social medical dichotomy, I think may not be the best way for us to deliver services, whether it's public services or private services. It just seems to me that it's all integrated, and it could change from a morning to a night, or from 1 hour to the other. So how are we going to deliver comprehensive, integrated, and safe and secure services for this growing silver tsunami population? I myself, I think, I'm considered a kid by most standards. I will be 63 this year. But I know I just celebrated someone's 103rd birthday who said, "Oh, you're just a kid." But I think part of my goal in being a very passionate advocate in this arena, and it's a vast and rich arena. We're talking about one sliver of the aging and long-term care discussion today, but I'm passionate about it because I would certainly like to fix it before I become a regular consumer. And so it's also self-interest now. It's not just personal and professional, it's self-interest. So with that, I want to thank you for letting me share these very general remarks. Glad you're all still awake. And I know we have some folks listening out there in internet land as well. I'd be happy to take questions from anyone that may have them, and we'll see if we have questions, and if we don't, then I'll just kind of hang around a little bit afterwards and chat. So thank you so very much for your attention.
Do we have questions for Assemblywoman Yamada?
Yes.
Is there any possibility of bringing up I forgot what I was going to say. I'm having a senior moment. The switch over from social services to the Department of Insurance.
The question is there any discussion or potential for resurrecting the discussion or a bill to transfer regulatory authority for CCRCs from the Department of Social Services to the Department of Insurance? As I mentioned, this year there is no legislation. I do not know whether there will be legislation next year or not. I think that the conversation should continue. However, there are many dynamics at work when you have big policy discussions like this. But I do think that there does need to be a review, whether it's Department of Social Services, Department of Insurance, wherever this all eventually lands. I think I am more of an advocate now of ensuring that there is one place in state government that we are able to sort of integrate all of the licenses that are out there. I think from an economic standpoint, from a business perspective, we have made this very difficult for people who wish to get into this service area. It's a matter of balancing all those perspectives, but I do think that it is an issue that does need continuing review. Some of it's policy, some of it's politics. And in terms of balancing that discussion, you know, California and the Department of Insurance, as well as the Department of Healthcare Services, you know, are all grappling with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And that's coming very, very soon. That's coming, I mean, we're in it now. We're in extraordinary session now addressing the implementation of the ACA, which I'm very happy that California is doing. However, there are so many issues related to implementation of this very major shift and expansion of healthcare services in California that, you know, again, this may be an issue that may not come back for a while. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any specific legislation that your committee is looking at right now for this session?
The question is there any specific legislation the Aging and Long-Term Care Committee is looking at for CCRCs in particular, or just in general? Oh, well, yes. I mean, we happen to have a few bills, but I've since taking office in 2009 and sort of living through the 4 worst years of, I think, California and our country's economy in quite a while, have taken the position that, you know, less is more. You know, we don't want to do bills when they're not necessary. Not every problem needs legislation as a solution. My focus this year has been primarily on some of our state institutions. We regrettably have a number of assault cases inside certain of our state institutions. Conditions for workers and residents and patients alike have been somewhat challenged and precarious, in particular with our state developmental center system, and in some cases our Napa State and other state hospitals. And so legislation that we're bringing forward would require a heightened or a shortened report period time of 2 hours for certain incidents that occur within state institutions, that they should be reported directly to local law enforcement rather than reported internally. You know, we are talking about some of the poorest and most vulnerable residents in California when they come to state responsibility. They have you know, other risk factors, sometimes don't have family members, do not have the resources to act on their own behalf. So my work has been primarily, you know, affecting those state institutional populations that I think are in need of greater safeguards. So that's part of what we're working on this year. We're also working on regulating home care in California. For those of you who may not know, the only requirement to establish a private home care agency in California is to get a business license. Now, this is not to say that there are, you know, not good home care agencies. There are many, many, many very good home care agencies. And of course, we here today are focusing on caring, you know, or residential facilities, so maybe less important in some cases. Although in independent living in a multi-level facility, some of you may have to rely upon non-medical home care assistance, either now or at some point. But right now in California, it's really kind of the wild, wild west. Again, on the state side, the IHSS, or in-home supportive services program in California, has seen many improvements over the past several years, and in some cases decades, but the last several years there have been improvements to how the state regulates and monitors home care for those who are impoverished in California. Now, in order to qualify for in-home supportive services, and I hope that none of you or none of us ever have to become impoverished in order to secure services, but you know, you have to spend down your assets to about, I think it's $2,000 cash assets is what you can have in order to qualify for IHSS. There are other certain exclusions. You can own, you know, one residence and one vehicle. and I'm sure there are other details to eligibility, but basically we're talking for the IHSS population in California, which by the way is now approximating almost 500,000 consumers. There are almost 500,000 impoverished Californians who qualify for in-home supportive services. But for the great middle, or what's left of us, the great middle, or the great middle that we hope will continue, to find a in-home supportive services like caregiver, there are certain options. You can go through an agency, lots of people go through friends, through church contacts. There are referral networks as well that are not regulated in the same way as self-regulated, I should say, by the same standard as some of the home care agencies. But people are turning to Craigslist to find home care workers. And I think that, again, with California being home to the largest number of older adults in the nation, I think it's time for us to do better than that, and to hopefully migrate some of the good principles that are applied to the IHSS Public Authority Program that manages a registry, that manages some training level standards, and background checks, criminal background checks. We're talking about people coming into your home that are going to perform some of the most intimate tasks possible for an individual that is usually home alone. And I think it's 2013 now, and we do not have regulation in our state over this very important issue area. The industry has actually come to us and asked to be regulated. And so I think, normally you don't hear very often when business comes to you and says, please regulate us. We want more regulation. It's kind of like, really, but we are working with CASA, the California Association for Health Services at Home, to bring forward what I believe to be a common sense and incremental approach to regulating home care in California. I think it's high time we do that. So thanks for letting me give a commercial about my bill. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Hi.
What do you think of doing after you term out?
Oh my, I don't know if we're allowed to make political comments. I already gave a plug for my bill. I have been in public office only for 10 years now. And I think I mentioned earlier that I've been rattling around working as a social worker somewhere for almost the last 40. So it's been only like a quarter of my time in public service, but I do enjoy public service. My husband is also a social worker, and so we share, we don't have to do a lot of explaining, it seems, for certain things, like why are we never at home? Of course our 2 children are grown now, so we're not leaving our children home alone. But I hope to continue my service in the future. If I am successful in a Senate run in the future, that will be in 2016. Because if we don't have a committee on aging in the Senate by that time, I certainly am making plans to ask for one if I should be successful in getting there. But that's a little bit down the road. It's about 3 years away.
We wish you well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Just for comparative purposes, if there are 500,000 Californians who are in need of in-home
Supportive services, yes.
how many CCRC residents are there in California?
Let's see, I think I do have that statistic while I'm looking at my fact sheet here. The question was if there are 500,000 in-home supportive services consumers in California, and of course they are living in their own homes or in their own domiciles. Right now, let's see, at any given time, there are, let's see, hold on just 1 second. Should have that number, or one of you might have that number.
I think it's about 20,000.
Is it? Yeah, there are approximately 80 CCRCs in California with about 20,000. So I had 80 in my mind, but so there are about 20,000 residents So that's a lot smaller right now, a smaller population group. So, you know, you're a small but hardy man, right? And of course, I see Mr. Rosette there, who is a constituent and our former CalCRA president right there, located in Davis in my district. And I guess someone asked me a little bit earlier to describe my current district, even though I'm here in my capacity today as Chair of Aging and Long-Term Care. I used to represent only 2 counties, that was Yolo and Solano primarily, not the entire county of Yolo, but almost the entire county of Solano. But due to the redistricting commission's work, as many of you know, the lines changed for all of us. And so I went from 2 counties to now all or parts of 6 counties. So I have the southern half of Colusa, all of Lake County, all of Napa County, part of Sonoma, part of Solano, and I do now have all of Yolo County except for the city of West Sacramento. So under the principle of one person, one vote, you know, it's the same number of constituents, you know, 460,000 some odd, approximately. But spread over all or parts of 6 counties just means that the geographic area has expanded greatly. You know, it's a great, big, beautiful new district, and there are many folks that are, you know, our age and older, and this is the growing number. I mean, there are certainly lots of young people at the University of California, Davis, that sometimes skew the statistics a little, but there are many, many older adults in not only my district, but certainly throughout California. So, you know, it's a challenging district with Lake County's median income $31,000 a year compared to Napa County, its neighbor, at about $69,000 a year. So it does require either one to be very balanced or very schizophrenic, I guess, in order to try to serve a district that is as large and diverse as the 4th Assembly District. But I think, you know, the other saving part of the aging and long-term care discussion is that it's really not a partisan discussion because you know, shouldn't be couched in Democratic terms or Republican terms or independent terms. You know, last time I checked, none of us was getting any younger. So I think it's a good place for all perspectives to try to come together to address how are we going to best serve this growing population without bankrupting oneself or other public resources. And you know, that's really the discussion that's going on at the federal level right now. Discussions about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. You know, these are programs, in my opinion, that have worked well, have prevented many people from becoming impoverished or impoverished further. And before we change it or tinker with it, I think we should examine its strengths and see how we can improve and make them more secure, each of these programs more secure, instead of, you know, saying that we're going to reduce the programs. But there are discussions, again, going on at very high levels, at the highest levels of our nation's you know, public arena. And you know, I think it requires us to be very vigilant about, you know, how things will develop over the next, I mean, it's happening right as we speak.
Good.
So any other questions? I think we reached our time. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I hope you you know, got some information that you didn't have, and we'll certainly be happy to make ourselves available as this discussion continues. Thanks so much.
I just wanted to give a very quick and very heartfelt thank you for your attendance here today. I know
Thanks very
you
much.
are extremely busy and today's
Okay.
the last day of a busy session, so
Thank you.
I'm sure you have to return, but thank you so much for carving time out of your schedule.
Thanks
to be
very
here.
much. Bye-bye.